Polarization, Spangler, Toynbee. So I take a very, very long approach to these questions, not about Trump or not about the last 20 years, but really think about what America was from the beginning, the experiences it has gone through. And in the back of my mind, there's always the idea that if we're talking about the growth of a civilization, then there are ups and downs, and there are moments of deep transformation, which to the actors involved look like collapse. But in the long history of civilization, they are the birth pangs of something new. And I think the main idea of the book is actually that America is now at the point where it will give its main contribution to humanity and to political history by developing a cultural and political system which for the first time is actually quite unique, quite separate from the European liberal tradition of the Enlightenment. I don't say that it's starting now. I suggest that the process can be, we can go back in time and find sort of the archaeological beginnings of that process. But this is a special moment, and Donald Trump, in that sense, is a sort of Hegelian hero that, without knowing anything about that, embodies the spirit of its time. It's become more difficult to argue that America is still the old America of the Enlightenment, of the European political tradition, even of the American Constitution, as we listen to Donald Trump and as we realize that he hasn't become the US president by chance. This reflects continuities, this reflects tendencies and trends that are coming from the past. In fact, in the book, I suggest at some point that if we look at the lineage of American presidents, at some point we start to detect changes with Kennedy, with Nixon, certainly with Reagan, certainly with George W. Bush, even with Obama, so with Clinton. All these presidents start to look from a European perspective difficult to comprehend, as opposed to those old statesmen, which in fact were part of the same sensibility that we have in Europe and Western Europe in particular. So the question I ask is, what is happening? How do we interpret this, and what conclusions do we take? But certainly it's a very different America. Now the question, is it in decline or not? You know, it's something, of course, it might be possible. I think there's a couple of books that just came out that argue that it's quite possible to make the argument for a certain disaggregation and decadence. That's the title of a book that just came out. But in the end, I don't think that's the best way to interpret what is happening in America. I look at America, I see still the same sources of energy, of creativity, still operational, still the same longing for the future. I don't see, going back to the books I read as a child and as a teenager, I don't see those prototypical elements of a civilization that has exhausted itself. I see the opposite. I see enormous struggle, a fight for the future that is happening in America right now. And I try to incorporate that in the book. Of course, there's now a very significant test and challenge to my thesis. The coronavirus crisis in America is taking really enormous proportions. We'll see in a few months what comes out of it. But I do feel inclined to thinking that even this crisis is another step in that process of, in a way, getting rid of many of the things that come from the past and creating something new. Let me stop here, see if you have some more questions before we turn to the listeners.
Thank you for that. Very, very interesting indeed. And I should invite our audience around the world, those people who have joined us today from here, from London, to put their questions. You have the button of questions and answers on this particular software. And so keep the questions coming to Bruno. This is a great opportunity to question the author on this very interesting book. Can I take you back to one of your points that you mentioned, which is the seeing Trump as a continuity? Now, again, this is one of these fundamental debates that have been going on for a while. Some people see him as, quite frankly, to use an impolite term, a freak of history. someone who just happened by some fluke, perhaps with the help of some Russians, to win power by just switching a few marginal states and winning the electoral college. But you seem to take a different view. You seem to suggest that he is in a way an outgrowth of a certain movement, even if he himself may not be aware of it. Try to unpack that one.
Right. Well, first of all, there's a certain sociology of America, which I think is in the end much more important than the psychology of Donald Trump. But that one is just as perplexing as Trump himself, and just as perplexing to Europeans. The fact that America seems perpetually in love with guns, in love with religion, that America is still committed to the death penalty. I think I say in the book that only China and Saudi Arabia can compete with America in terms of how many people are executed every year. These are, and others could be pointed out, these are elements that point towards a society that is different from the European Enlightenment model. And they have resisted these characteristics. So I spent a few pages criticizing the idea, which is very popular in many circles, that in fact America is moving towards a European model, moving towards Denmark, as I think Fukuyama says, and just have to wait. Well, the presidency of Barack Obama was, in a sense, a test of this. In the book, or in an article I wrote recently, I call him the Ataturk, the Mustafa Kemal of South Side. In Turkey right now, so it's an appropriate metaphor. You know, the statesman that kind of leads his people towards modernity and the Enlightenment, and helps them let go of those links to religion, to guns, to a more traditional society. Well, I spent those pages talking about this, but essentially mocking this idea, because it seems to me rather absurd. It's perplexing, actually, how we got to a point where we feel comfortable calling America a traditional society. I think European intellectuals of 2-3 generations ago, a post-war period, Sartre, for example, they were fascinated by America. There was this sort of uprooted society that lived almost entirely in the future, in love with technology. Now, apparently, we believe that America is a little bit like Anatolia or Kazakhstan. So I mock those ideas. And in fact, what I defend is America is a specific kind of society, deserves perhaps the term postmodern more than modern, because it has gone through the processes that European societies have gone through. He has detected some problems with the path that European societies have taken, and is now in the process of looking for something different and for a way to solve those contradictions, in a way to reconcile religion with freedom and democracy in a way that European societies were never able to. And as I point out in a section of the book, more turned towards the future, to reconcile technology with freedom as well, which is something that European societies are really struggling with. And I'm rather despondent that they will be able to solve this problem. How do you reconcile freedom and technology? So I see a society that is in the grip of these contradictions and try to solve them rather than being overwhelmed by them. And then, you know, culturally, psychologically, you know, even if we just talk about American presidents, if we want to talk about a certain love of show business and reality of transforming the White House into a reality TV show, is Donald Trump all that different from Bill Clinton, really? This is, you know, when I was fascinated by America even more than I am now, in my early 20s, following the Clinton impeachment, following the Monica Lewinsky saga. Was that different from Donald Trump? In a way, Donald Trump just makes it explicit, but it was already there as an implicit undercurrent.
Very interesting indeed. I wonder if I could pick up on another strand. I mean, you seem to suggest that at some point, President Woodrow Wilson, immediately after the First World War, was, in a way, was attempting to create a new bond, but that somehow that failed, because at the end of the day, it was more the United States trying to copy the European model rather than the other way around. That also seems to me to be a bit counterfactual. The assumption always in Europe was that Woodrow Wilson, and indeed one could argue the same about Roosevelt on the edge of the end of the Second World War, were trying to Americanize Europe by trying to suggest American solutions to what were seen as European problems, but you don't see it that way.
Well, I think the way I see it, very briefly, so last decade of the 19th century, America became economically the most powerful country in the world. And already the first decade of the 20th century was quickly becoming the most important power across all dimensions, even politically, very involved in the issues in China at the time, and being recognized as the predominant power. Now, a process in a way similar, and I make that comparison a number of times in the book to what is happening now in China. But that creates a challenge for the rising power, because in a way it has to get rid of the instinctive attachment to the world order that allowed it to rise. The United States became the most powerful country in the world at the turn of the century because it was integrated in the world created by the British Empire and benefited from it, in the same way that China today became the most powerful manufacturing economy in the world because it is integrated in the American global order. Now, how do you then take the step of breaking with the order that allowed you to rise, and also breaking psychologically and culturally with it? Same way that the United States was culturally dependent on Europe, I think it's true today that China is in many respects culturally dependent on the West. It's one of my most vivid memories of the year I spent in China last year is you go through the Chinese universities and you see it's very difficult to find an original thinker. You go there looking for them, but they have been trained thinking along Western lines, which then they sort of water down for their own political necessities, but it's what's there. It's very difficult to develop an original way of thinking. At the same time that the economy, the economic infrastructure, it's already rising and powerful. What I argue in the book, and this is a question of course open to debate and discussion, was that in fact the United States ended up waiting for Europe to completely collapse. At the end of World War I, there would have been an opportunity for the process to be managed from Washington. In fact, I explain the disasters of the 30s, or I suggest, I don't think the book really spends the necessary time and attention with this question, but I suggest that the disasters of the 30s and Second World War result from the fact that the United States simply could not find a way to break psychologically and culturally with Europe and create a new world order. I mentioned how the American soldiers after World War I were fascinated by life in Europe. They never concluded, if you read those reports, that European civilization had collapsed. The experience after World War II was completely different. There was nothing left to defend in Europe after World War II. It's the fundamental difference between the two world wars. And that created, of course, a kind of energy and dynamism in America of looking for new paths, which was not possible before. Europe suddenly, if you read documents at the time, particularly there's a symposium published by Partisan Review in 1952, where every American intellectual of every stripe essentially concludes there's nothing left in Europe to admire or look up to. We now are on our own path and we are alone. That's a very formative moment, and that's in fact where I detect the beginnings of this new America that I talk about. It's the subtitle of the book. Very quickly we get to the 60s where everything looks different, and where everything looks different from Europe, where Jack Kerouac or Elvis Presley are no longer artists or intellectuals trying to imitate the European intellectual. They are not like Hemingway or Scott Fitzgerald. They are American to the bone. And then we got Kennedy, we got Nixon, and America is on a different path, which in a way, sociological, is a process that ends up taking a long time because the people, the generation that is still in charge, the greatest generation, was still educated in a European model. So we really have to wait for the baby boomers to be in charge to start to see a completely different America. And the first baby boomer president is, of course, Bill Clinton. And by that time, things are indeed very different from what is happening in Europe, from European sensibility, from a European culture. World War II, in my book, really plays the role of setting Europe and the US on separate paths, which, again, I guess you might suggest is counterintuitive because we do tend to think that that's the moment when they came together. You want me to?
No. I'm just thinking, or perhaps this is the moment where we can bring in some of the audience. So I've got a question here from Roddy Williams, an Oxford academic and also a man involved in business today with a lot of experience of the United States. He's asking whether all this sort of bifurcation, the way that we sort of seem to take different routes between Europe and the United States, may be due to the passing of the war generation, the Second World War generation, that in a way what we have witnessed is a snapshot that was unique to that period and was never due to return, was never due to endure. How do you feel about that?
No, absolutely. Again, I think there's a sociological element here. Dean Acheson, I think, never went to East Asia. All the time that he was Secretary of State, it'd be unthinkable today. There was a generation that still thought of itself as essentially culturally and psychologically European. And obviously it was a generation that was in charge for still a couple of decades after World War II. I think there were other important processes. The construction of the European Union was very important. Until the European Union really came into its own with the single market and the economic power that came with it, it was not possible for Europeans to even consider a separate path. But then that started to happen. And in the end, even people like de Gaulle saw the immediate connection between the European Union and the desire for Europe to create its own separate path. In this book, I'm much more interested in seeing how America has developed its own separate path, but it's happening simultaneously on the European side. But I think it's more interesting on the American side because it really involves breaking with a cultural tradition, a historical tradition that went back to the founding. And in a way, realizing the prophecy, which is everywhere in the 19th century, that America would one day develop its own culture. If you read Whitman, if you read Emerson, this is their dream that they cannot realize. They are not in a position to realize, but they're sort of talking to their descendants and saying, one day, America will be able to develop its own culture. And what they mean by its own culture is obviously not novelists that are good enough to win the Nobel or painters that can compete with European painters. No, it's developing a way of looking at the world, a worldview that is fundamentally different from the European Enlightenment worldview. There's something deeply revolutionary about that project, which I argue in the book is then realized as the generation coming out of the war is replaced by new people and new blood, by the invention, of course, of new art forms. Cinema was to some extent an annunciation of that, but not fully realized. Cinema was in the beginning a European invention. And many of the greatest directors in the first half of the century were coming from Europe. And television is fundamentally the American art form. And that also contributes to the development of this new sensibility. But I agree with the listener that it was really important in the end for a new generation to arise that was not educated in this culture. I think today, even in the time I studied in America, I think today even more, you go to study at the best American universities, not in order to get a traditional European education. You won't get that there, and many people complain that you can't get that there. Those that would wanted to survive. But that was, of course, the case, let us say, in 1900, where you went to Harvard to get a traditional European education from the Greeks, the Romans, Shakespeare, and all that tradition. What you get in America today is something different.
Um, I think we've got a very interesting question which I'd like to pick up from Jörg Schimmelfenning, who is asking about the power of attraction of the United States. I mean, one of the argument, you remember the Joe Nye argument about soft power, the idea of the American dream, the anti-monarchist pure democracy claim right up from the 18th century to the 21st. How much of that new forging of a new culture and a new identity that you talk about is completely, not merely uncopyable by others, but uninteresting to others, and therefore unlikely to have a power of attraction?
Well, I disagree with that. Well, this idea of a power of attraction seems to me to have taken an odd turn that we now interpret it in a very romantic way. But that was never the meaning of soft power or this power of attraction. It was never the fact that we regarded someone or a country with benevolence and affection. It was the fact that we are genuinely fascinated, attracted, a mixture of awe and fear, respect. And that I think is still very much present. Perhaps we don't have the warmest feelings, many of us in Europe today, towards what is happening in America. But the fact remains that people all over the world are fascinated by America. This book comes out of an interview or a conversation I had with the economist Tyler Cohen. At some point, he asked me, "What is America for you?" And I said, "Well, I don't quite know." And then as I came out of the interview, I thought, it's pretty embarrassing if you want to consider yourself someone who thinks about the contemporary world if you don't have an answer to that. So then I decided to write the book. And in that same conversation, we were discussing the question that you just asked me. And we look at everyone in Europe, but all over the world, is following these press briefings by President Trump, and not only, but also by Andrew Cuomo. There was an essay in the FT a couple of weeks ago where the author said that everyone in Delhi is following the Cuomo's briefings. Why, if America is so uninteresting, and if this power of attraction has disappeared, why are we doing this? Obviously, we're doing it because there is something about America that is deeply attractive. And what I suggest in the book is meant to be an answer to these questions. So I don't just say that there is a power of attraction. I suggest that it's rooted in this love of fantasy, of imaginary worlds, this ability to leave reality behind, which in a way appeals to every human being. Reality being often drab and boring and painful, there is in human nature a desire to leave it behind. America, I suggest in the book, has built a civilization on the cornerstone of leaving reality behind. This is the center of the American political and social personality. And that I think is very attractive to people all over the world. And if you look at American soft power from the beginning of the 20th century, you see that this factor is always there. Hollywood promises this to people. American television promises this to people. And Silicon Valley promises this to people. Silicon Valley with its suggestion of the creation of imaginary worlds based in technology. Silicon Valley with the idea that an individual founder has an idea that will change the world and then finds the capital to do that. I suggest in the book, Silicon Valley, if you want a model of what Silicon Valley is about, you have to go back to the Hollywood studios because it's the same thing. Someone arrives with an idea, which then needs money and capital, a lot of it, to be executed in a way to create an imaginary world that is better, or at least more exciting, more thrilling than the real world. And this continues to be very appealing to people all over the world. Perhaps Hollywood not as much, but Silicon Valley is everywhere. You go to Beijing or Shenzhen or Bangalore, and everyone wants to create their own Silicon Valley. Everyone speaks in the same language, and everyone tries to do something of the same. Again, the promise of the imaginary world is the promise of American life. And this promise is very appealing, very attractive to everyone in a way. It's just the fact that America has realized it in a way that's not been realized anywhere else. And other societies have taken different paths. thereby creating a gulf that we can see today.
Um, let me test your sort of your feeling of a sort of almost a Hegelian progression here. From against the counterpoint made just now online by John Kampfner, one of Britain's leading sort of commentators, who was suggesting that Europe has its own share of people like Trump, people who appear in a sort of populist impulse to try to redo politics, of anyone from Mr. Orban in Budapest to Mr. Berlusconi in Rome, and anywhere in between. And that the progression was often reversed, that these people who somehow seemed to project a new cultural identity, a new approach to politics, a new way of life, have been rebuffed by electorates who then went back to what ultimately looked the very traditional kinds of politicians. So can one be so sure about extrapolating in a linear fashion, which you appear to be doing, about the development of the United States?
Well, let me tell you, and John, what I think is the fundamental difference between Trump and Berlusconi, because I think they are diametrically opposed. Berlusconi wants to use the tricks and the processes of show business in order to be a more successful politician. But he's always trying to be a politician. And he's trying to look the role of the politician. So his transition is, in a way, complete. He comes from show business. He uses the fame and he uses some of the tricks that he acquired there in order to become a successful politician. Trump, and I think this is difficult to understand and maybe to accept because it is so extraordinary in a way. Trump does the opposite. He uses the platform of politics to be a better television star. He wants to be a star. He doesn't want to be a politician. It's just that politics, the White House, offers a perfect medium and a perfect platform for that. If you see at what Trump does, he behaves like a television host, or in some cases a script writer. He will suggest all kinds of cliffhangers. I remember one about Turkey where he tweeted, I've talked to Mike Pompeo, I've talked to Mnuchin, all this is being discussed. Sanctions or no sanctions against Turkey, stay tuned, exclamation mark. So he's building a show that is the greatest show on earth because it is a show about what is happening on earth. The real world has been uplifted into a television show. This is not what Berlusconi did. Berlusconi, if anything, had a certain inferiority complex where he was always trying to look like a great statesman. Trump doesn't want to look like a great statesman. Trump wants to look like the greatest television star in history. He talks about his ratings all the time. In these press briefings, they're really quite extraordinary. You're just staring at TV and wondering if you really heard what he's saying. But he's saying, yes, 2,000 people died, but I'm getting the highest ratings ever. And that's a trade-off there. But in the end, the ratings may be more important. So I think Trump and Berlusconi are not similar creatures in any way. And what Trump is doing, unbeknownst to himself, I'm not suggesting that he has full awareness of these things, but what he's doing, and the electorate, at least large part of the electoral applauds, is actually much more radical. And I say, I'm not sure it's just his supporters, because his opponents seem just as fascinated, just as enthralled by the show as the supporters are. And I even suspect some people will vote for him, finding him rather despicable, but because they just cannot see themselves going back to the boring old days of a more conventional politician. There's a sense, I think, during the campaign where people were fascinated by this history, by the story of a kind of a boisterous, vulgar real estate developer that can become president, and they wanted to take that story to the end. And the way to take it to the end is to actually elect him. there was a fascination with the story, which could, of course, have been the plot of a movie or a television series in a way that Hillary Clinton's victory could not. This is different from Berlusconi, although it could superficially, or it's different from Schwarzenegger, although superficially it could look similar. It is an entirely different process. In the book, I call this a Copernican turn, because it's not using show business for the sake of politics. It's using politics for the sake of show business. Show business is now at the top of the pyramid. This is not true for Berlusconi, in my opinion.
Thank you. Let's turn as to perhaps for a few minutes as to what it means for us on this side of the Atlantic Ocean. So we've got a question from Paul Hauff, who is asking directly that question: what does it mean for Europe? And perhaps I could tie it in for a question from Mike Gapes, a long-serving British parliamentarian, who sort of asks, what does it mean for America's, for extended deterrence, for America's nuclear umbrella, for Europe, for the whole question of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization?
Right. Well, first of all, I don't think these cultural differences, and even in a way civilizational differences between Europe and America, they don't have direct and obvious geopolitical consequences, in the sense that it's entirely possible for Europe and America, if they are concerned with the threat from China, which is a threat to both of them in different ways, to work together. I think actually, on the contrary, that if we drop this obsession about finding common cultural areas between Europe and America, that the relationship between the two sides could be better. If Europeans just accept that America has a different kind of society where guns are common and the death penalty is accepted, and we accept that as a fact of life, and that the different societies and different civilizations choose different paths, that our geopolitical relationship with the United States could be better if we get rid of this, which is always a source of noise in the relationship. Having said that, I think Europe has to be prepared to be more alone than it was in the past. That this transatlantic front, which lasted, of course, because there was an enemy in the shape of the Soviet Union, has been weakened and continues to be weakened. And Europe has to realize and accept that. That's already very obvious during the coronavirus crisis. There was an interesting moment, a kind of a Freudian slip, when von der Leyen said the other day that Europe needs a Marshall Plan, a sort of instinctive recourse to the father figure of the United States that saved us when we really needed to be saved. You know, I think she should have said that Europe needs to create a Marshall Plan, not to receive a Marshall Plan, but somehow she left that behind, that this would be the time for Europe to think about a way to reconstruct those parts of the continent that are going to be deeply affected by the crisis, and some parts will be. But there's still this instinctive feeling that we need the United States to do that. That was already the case with Brexit. I think if the old America had been there, probably Brexit would not have happened, because the American president would have, behind the scene, rather than openly like Obama did, exercise a certain level of pressure and persuasion to make sure, convinced that it was in America's interest that Britain would not leave the EU. So it's not just starting today, but it goes back a while, that Europe has to learn how to live alone. This loneliness is going to be very traumatic, because we're going to be going through a number of important crises, and they could deepen, cascading crises, and Europe is going to have to solve them alone, and having a very dangerous neighborhood on top of it. As for American foreign policy and security policy in general, well, I suggest that we need a new paradigm, which in a way is going to be one in between the two available ones. We have the idea of isolationism, where Europe retreats inside its own borders. We have the neoconservative paradigm, where Europe doesn't retreat within its own borders, but in a way tries to take those borders everywhere, tries to make the whole world look like America. We need a different paradigm for America, which is going to be difficult because it goes against tradition, in a way against American psychology, where America will act in the world, but in the knowledge that the world is a foreign, very different, a strange place, different from America, without any attempt to convert it to an American model. And there, I think America has a lot to learn from 19th century Europe, from old doctrines of balance of power, where different regimes have to deal with each other, where just as the United Kingdom was concerned in the 19th century, making sure that no power would become too powerful on the continent, the United Kingdom knew that it was more powerful than each of its rivals individually, but less powerful than all of them combined. Now, I suggest in one of the chapters that this is the most promising model for America to adapt to its own circumstances, in a way to make sure that neither China nor Russia, nor a combination of China or Russia, is able to exercise power over the whole of Eurasia and parts of Africa. This, which when I wrote the book looked like a very theoretical question, might become a very practical one. If within the next few months or next 2 years, some parts of the world go through a dramatic economic and political collapse, which is entirely possible as a result of the coronavirus immediate health crisis, but also economic crisis, then it will be a very pressing question. What is the power that goes in, tries to provide order and stabilize the situation in exchange for, of course, geopolitical benefits? I don't want to give too many examples, but imagine something like this happens in a country like Indonesia. If Indonesia is in a situation where the health crisis gets out of control, where the economy is collapsing, could be Russia, by the way, could be India potentially. I don't want to say India because I'll get lots of people on Twitter disagreeing with the idea. But if an important geopolitical country in the world goes through a period of turmoil, is it going to be China to come in and provide order and stability? Or is the United States going to do it? Or if it's in the European neighborhood, is it going to be Europe? But certainly if China does it, then it will be a new Marshall Plan, a Chinese Marshall Plan. I always thought that the Belt and Road Initiative was not a Marshall Plan, but this could be a Marshall Plan where China would go in, would provide basic stability, would provide for economic recovery in exchange of shaping that country, A, B, or C, whatever the country is in its image. So all these questions, which are rather theoretical when I wrote the book, I think are going to become very practical very soon.
I think the next question is from Robert Fox of the Evening Standard newspaper here in London, who's actually picking you up on exactly the point about China, which is, as he puts it, a sort of obsession of the competition with China that now is the hallmark of a lot of the American foreign and security policy. Is this in a way going to detract the United States from its future? Is it a detraction? Is it a sort of a superfluous activity? Or is it essential to the way the United States is going to evolve?
It is essential, but it will necessitate a change of approach, of paradigm, I think. And it's happening already with the Trump presidency. America has to be much more concerned about containing Chinese power than about changing China. I think that's the crucial difference. But during the trade war, before Corona arrived, we saw that inside the White House, there was disagreement about this, that some people wanted to impose a number of fundamental constitutional changes to China at the level of the economic constitution, eliminate subsidies to Chinese companies. And others were much more interested in containing Chinese power. By the way, if you're concerned with Chinese subsidies, it's very easy to solve the problem. You just have to apply countervailing tariffs. Not random tariffs, but tariffs that have been designed specifically to countervail the effect of subsidies on global markets. So the United States could have a choice of, do we want to change China, or do we accept China as it is? But it's still going to be a question of trying to limit the extent of Chinese power, because we see that, and this is a message that everyone in Southeast Asia will try to convey to you, that if China does not see any obstacle in its way, then its ambition is fired up in a way that actually could be destabilizing for the world order. So again, as we were talking about, the approach has to be an approach of balance of power. It has also to be an approach, and I think this would fit with the new America that I am describing, an approach where actually America as a whole, its decision makers, but also Americans, would be interested in different cultures, would be interested in the narrative possibilities of being in contact with distinct cultures and different cultures. That this neoconservative persuasion has been very toxic, not just at the political level, but also at the cultural level. This idea that the whole world is on a path of becoming like America has to be abandoned. And that even for American culture and this new flourishing of American culture that I am describing, an interest in the world outside your borders is very productive. There's no great movie or great novel that doesn't use the exoticism of foreign landscapes. So I really dream about an America that rediscovers this interest in what is different, in what is strange, rather than assuming necessarily that a country, if it doesn't look like America, it's because it is flawed. And those flaws need to be redressed, and the country needs to become like America. You know, if there's a central idea in my book is to try to argue that it's high time for this to be abandoned for all sorts of reasons. It's been destabilizing for the global order. It's been toxic for America's image, more toxic, I would defend, than Donald Trump. I think the Iraq War has been more toxic for America's image than Donald Trump. Donald Trump is actually a character that people have in many parts of the world a rather fondness for, in China, in Japan, in India. Certainly not among European elites, but in many other parts of the world. So it's been toxic for America's image. It's been toxic for the world order. It's been an obstacle for this cultural renaissance that I think is possible in America today. So if there's one thing I would like to argue for in the book is to get over this and actually realize that its impact has been much more negative than people think and much more widespread than people think, not just limited to foreign policy, but actually affecting American life and American psychology very deeply. It doesn't come out of the neoconservative movement as such. It comes out of the Cold War, of a certain, as I discuss in the book, of a certain way of interpreting the Truman Doctrine, which at the beginning had a certain scope and then was, in my opinion, distorted over the next decade or two.
We have a question from Malcolm Chalmers, our Deputy Director General here at the Institute in London, and also in a way from Simon Chilton, another member of the Institute, about the polarization that one sees in the United States, everything from the culture wars to the political wars, where almost everything is, to use the cliche media term, toxic in one way or another to one camp or another. And where you get the feeling that decisions cannot be taken, that the system is paralyzed by this extreme polarization. Is that going to be part of the culture? Is it a transition phase to a new sort of path of the United States?
Well, I think in a way, again, like I do in many passages of the book, I try at least to make an effort to see why this is the case and try to interpret not necessarily as a perversion, but having another side that shows why it is in a way necessary and what people are trying to pursue as they engage in this, let us say, polarization. And the truth is that societies that are not polarized in this way, in many respects, they avoid that because they have removed every important question from the political process. And now this has advantages, but also has disadvantages. Many Western European societies are not polarized, and practically everyone can be in government because the questions that are addressed by the political process are minimal. Whether taxes are at 22% or 23%, questions of this sort, very technical, but also very minimal. Now, I'm not convinced that this is either a solution that is stable or a solution that is desirable. That it is not stable, I think, is becoming very obvious. If you want to build European societies on the basis that nothing very important happens and everyone can more or less agree, You're not going to be able to do that because we are suddenly in the middle of large historical processes and historical events like the pandemic, but also like China's rise and others. So European societies will have the very traumatic process of having to incorporate divisive issues into their political processes. I mean, same thing, you had just a quick digression. In Turkey, Turkish democracy seems always on the verge of collapse, but one of the reasons it's on the verge of collapse, it's not because Turks are bad at democracy, it's because the issues that are brought into the political process are so important, so divisive, that evidently the political process has trouble digesting them. Whereas Denmark and Norway, the political process works very smoothly because the inputs are very digestible. Questions are not divisive and not important. So I think what is happening in America has to do with this, has to do with the fact that important questions are being inserted into the process, that America has this love of drama and of important questions that it cannot let go of. I think recently with Trump, it's even acquired this kind of perverse love of the catastrophe, that it has almost reenacted the collapse of a democracy, but it's a sort of dramatic reenactment rather than reality. But you got the resistance, you got the dictator in the guise of a Mussolini or even a Hitler. And there's been books written about this and intellectuals that keep trying to interpret the American situation in terms of Germany in the 1930s. But this is a sort of a love of drama. It becomes cinematic rather than real. And I think because I don't take for a moment seriously the idea that Trump is an aspiring dictator. By the way, he had an excellent opportunity over the past month or two to use the crisis as a pretext, as Orban has done, and he shows no sign of doing that. Now, I think one way out of this polarization, to be brief, is to go through it the way America is going through it and realize that the issues are not, in a way, issues of life and death. That much of it has to do with this love of drama, that much of it has to do with this love of the thrilling moment and the thrilling experience. That Trump is not trying to destroy American democracy. That American theocrats, when you see a video of someone saying that she's not afraid of coronavirus because she has been covered in Christ's blood and so she is protected, that she may sound like someone in Iran or perhaps in a madrasa in Indonesia, but all this is rather ironic. She doesn't really believe that. There's in America a reenactment on many different narratives, and the religious narrative is constantly being reenacted. But again, at a level of fantasy, of unreality, which if we realize that is the case, then we learn not to take things so literally. Someone said, I don't know if it was Peter Thiel or someone else, but someone said, the crucial thing about Trump is that you have to take him seriously, but not literally. And I think that's the lesson about America today, to take it seriously, as I do in my book. A lot of effort went into it, but don't take these things literally. Don't think that the lady saying she's covered in the blood of Christ is an aspiring martyr in love with theocrats, because she would be the first one to lose interest in this if it became serious. If homosexuals were being executed in the mall in DC as they are in Tehran.
Bruno, we have a number of questions about unsurprisingly, about how unique is the United States in many ways, people looking for different yardsticks to compare that one. So we have two questions, one from you and Grant and the other one from Tim Dowes, about the demography, whether the demography makes a difference, whether the fact that this is still relatively, by developed country standards, a young society, and also a society that is quite capable of sort of absorbing large amounts of immigrants in a way that other countries have difficulty with. So in this sort of American exceptionalism, is it important? Is it likely to remain important and will continue?
Yes. and this is very important about America. There's a book coming out by American journalist and intellectual, well-known one, Matthew Iglesias, I think called 1 Billion Americans. It will be a question that America will have to pose itself. Also go back to Robert's question. As it confronts China, it may come to the conclusion that this differential in size and population may have to be redressed in some way. So perhaps America will be interested in the idea of adopting policies that can allow it to grow, and immigration would be one of them, if you could eliminate the political resistance to this. But I'm looking forward to this book. It's, I think, essentially a proposal that America should grow to a country with a billion inhabitants. The democracy is important in all kinds of other ways. So in the book, I'm interested in actually taking the necessary conclusions from the fact that America very soon will no longer be a white majority country, that its ethnic origins are incredibly diverse, and this has contributed to this break with Europe. I think Americans at some point were forced to realize, and in some cases were happy to realize, that the origins of America are all over the planet, that America was essentially built through 4 stages of demographic expansion: Native Americans, the European, essentially British colonists, the African Americans, and then in the 20th century, in the Great Migration, enormous importance of receiving immigrants from China, from Japan, from the Philippines, from Russia. So what resulted from that was not only a culture and a demography that is fundamentally different from Europe, and it's of course fascinating to try to see how, for example, African American, but in some cases African culture was absorbed very deeply, more deeply than some people want to admit, into the backbone of American society. But also, I think, in a way that actually created an active resistance against the identification between America and Europe. In a way, one could perhaps interpret political correctness as a movement that tries to reconcile America with the fact that it is not a European white country, that it needs to accept that fact and to open up its structures and its way of thinking to other cultures and other ways of looking at the world. So again, even political correctness, I think, can be interpreted in these terms as a positive fact, as a reconciliation with the reality of American demography. One could talk, and I want to go on for too long on this question, but also about the fact that Asian Americans have become so important in providing really a balance to European culture. Asian Americans are going to become the largest part of American immigrants within a decade or a decade and a half. Changes that are very important, and I think explain at the sort of the root level of demography some of the changes that I discuss in the book.
Thank you. And for the last question, you would expect us, since we are an institute primarily based in the UK, to ask the fundamental, the famous Brexit question. Madeleine Moon, another parliamentarian, has asked you, where does this all leave the United Kingdom? In a way, like many other countries, but perhaps with more justification than many other countries, it claims to have a special relationship with the United States. It claims that it would be able to redefine its relationship with many other countries after leaving the European Union. Where do you think it leaves us if your idea of the United States turns up to be the one that is correct?
Well, you know, before I tell you my opinion, let's look at what's happened over the past 3 or 4 years. It's very obvious that the United Kingdom, having left the European Union, still feels rather close to the European way of thinking about the world. There was a succession of opportunities for the United Kingdom to break with the EU on a number of international questions. Paris Agreement, Iran deal, arms control, and so on. And Conservative Party, where many people might be inclined to operate that change, didn't do it. And I don't think the reason was not Brexit and the fact that the United Kingdom was still dependent on Europe. The reason was these profound changes that I'm talking about, that the United Kingdom, in fact, over the past 3 or 4 decades became much more continental than it used to be, and that the United States, as I discuss in the book at great length, has also become, in a way, almost unrecognizable also to British elites. One of the reasons that I have been so surprised, my reaction to Brexit, as you know, because we've talked about this a lot, has essentially been, I would have voted Remain if I was British, or if I could have voted there, but it didn't seem to me that fundamental change that everyone was talking about. Martin Wolf in the Financial Times, the most consequential change and event since World War II, it's apparently now, reading his text yesterday or today, is now being replaced by the coronavirus crisis. And that's in fact how one should think about these things, that it actually puts Brexit in perspective. That now we see what a real crisis is. Now we see what an event of historical significance is. And perhaps we shouldn't have been so excited and distraught, pulling our hairs out about Brexit as some people were. What does that mean in practice? Well, I always suspected that after leaving the EU, the United Kingdom will remain still rather close to the EU, operating according to the